action item that if you aren't already subscribing to our Outlook magazine, we have issues that have addressed some of this in the past and will address it in the future. If you'd like to get a copy of this booklet, it's available to you as well, and you can just simply call us or contact us, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or leave a message at pointofview.net. And so those are just a couple of ideas on how you can educate yourself about this issue. And in particular, if you are wanting to share some of this material with your children, maybe because you want to have some limits on their social media, maybe you'd like to share it with people in the church. Of course, there's a podcast that's available and a variety of other resources. So I would encourage you to take advantage of what we make available so often here at Point of View. Before I get into the influence of social media in particular, let's for just a minute talk about the influence of media in general. And as I've spoken about this, there's probably a lot of ways to make the case, but probably the simplest way to make the case is to simply look at an article that appeared years ago in Christianity Today by George Barna, in which he was looking at what are oftentimes referred to as the sources of significant influence. And these SSIs, as they are called, help us understand, who, in a sense, sets the agenda for our culture and where do we see the greatest influence taking place. And so he concluded that the primary sources of social influence and significant influence in our society today come from movies, television, the internet, books, music, public policy and law, and family. Now, interestingly enough, this was done largely before we had a lot more social media, so I suspect that the internet might even become number one, simply because not only are people on the internet on their computers, they're on the internet on their phones. But the point I'm making is that if you look at that list, you recognize that the first five have something in common. They're all the media. And so this is, I think, an illustration of something I think we already sort of intuitively know, but we can now document with some level of precision. And that is, the media has become primarily a socializer of our society in general and our children in particular. Matter of fact, there have been some very significant studies done by the Kaiser Family Foundation looking at the media usage of young people ages 8 to 18. And one of the things you notice is they update this about every 5 years. And every time they update it, the number of hours of media usage go up at least another hour. So from 7.5 hours to 8.5 hours to almost 11 hours to now even further. And since a lot of those studies were really developed back in the 1990s and then into the 21st century, you can see the remarkable growth in terms of the influence of television, of computers, even of music, because once you have the iPod and the iPad and the iPhone and things like that, music. And so almost every aspect of media usage increased dramatically during that period of time. And there was only one exception. Reading has gone down. And so, again, when you talk about electronic media, it has had a profound impact in our society. Well, as we get into some of the issues associated with media, it's probably worth mentioning just for a minute that obviously we don't have any Bible verses which talk about social media or iTunes or Instagram or Facebook, but they do give us some general principles and standards, and one of those certainly is the idea that we should really flee from those things which are going to be detrimental to our Christian life. The Apostle Paul, when he writes perhaps his last letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:22, says, "Flee from youthful lust," and goes on to say that pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. You can go into Colossians 3:8, which where Paul says, we should rid ourselves of such things as anger and rage and malice and slander and filthy language from our lips. So if we're going to want to pay attention to what comes into our eye gate and our ear gate, how do we do that? And of course, he gives us a very clear indication of that in Philippians 4:8, when he says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And so again, we have quite a bit of evidence to suggest that we should be people that have a level of discernment. And one of the things we talk about so often when we talk about media is the need for discernment. We can, for example, recognize that when you're talking about movies and television, but even YouTube videos and a variety of other things, you can see that the media oftentimes presents an unreal view of the world. You have predictable plots, one-dimensional characters. In some respects, life is much more complicated than that. Some of these situation comedies, all the problems are resolved within a 30-minute situation comedy. Doesn't happen that way in life. It also presents, as I think you could also see, this idea of an oversimplified view of the world in which all sorts of difficulties are easily eradicated. But perhaps the greatest concern is, especially when we talk about this area of social media, the media desensitizes its viewers. Now, there used to be a time not so long ago that if you wanted to watch a movie, especially those of you that are listening to this or older, you'd have to go to a movie theater. Well, now, of course, you can get those movies. They come to your home. Originally, they were through things like videotapes and DVDs, but now, of course, you have streaming. And young people watching movies all the time and watching video all the time on their computers and on their smartphones. And so, in a result, this issue of desensitization has become perhaps greater than ever before. And so, when we come back from the break, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we've learned about the influence of social media. If you see me trying to say that indeed there is no reason that you should have access to these digital devices, that's not what I'm arguing for. If you think I'm arguing that you get rid of your computers and your telephone, your television, your phonograph records and all that kind of stuff, no. But we are recognizing that a wise and discerning Christian is going to want to develop some levels of discernment and maybe some boundaries. So we're going to talk about how are these digital devices affecting the way we perceive the world. We've learned a lot more just in the last few years, and I'll share that with you right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The current showdown with Iran brought lots of commentary. At times like this, lots of people become instant foreign policy experts. I don't claim to be one of them, but I do know that some of the comments being made are off track. I've read pundits trying to argue that Iran is not our enemy and isn't a threat to us. Some have argued that the principal reason for Iranian belligerence is due to the fact that last year the Trump administration withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often referred to as the Iran nuclear deal. While that may be true, consider some of the incidents between Iran and the U.S. that precede the government's decision to pull out of the nuclear deal. Back in 1979, angry mobs stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days until the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. Iran was also behind the attack of the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in 1983 that killed more than 300 Marines while they slept. And in 1988, when Iran tried to disrupt the flow of oil, they placed mines in the Persian Gulf, leading to the damage of an American ship. President Reagan ordered Operation Praying Mantis and was able to sink 6 Iranian ships. More recently, the Pentagon reported that they estimated that Iran was directly responsible for the deaths of at least 600 U.S. soldiers in Iraq. Unless you think this is merely a partisan issue, both 2016 presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, described Iran as the world's chief sponsor of terrorism. And the State Departments of the last 2 administrations have also come to the same conclusion. We may disagree about how to respond to Iran, but let's at least admit that this is a nation where people in the streets chant "Death to America." I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about social media today, and again, let me encourage you to get a free copy of my book on social media. It's actually a booklet, I should say, and it's available through Point of View, although I do have a book that I'm also going to be reading from Arts, Media, and Culture. Now, of course, since the publisher charges us, we have to charge you, but for the booklet, if you'd like to get a copy, feel free to contact us. But in my chapter on the new media and society, I quote from Rachel Marsden, who, writing in the Wall Street Journal, kind of wanted to set aside this idea that all this technology is going to make our kids smarter. I think as you're going to find out this section of our discussion, it might actually do more harm than good sometimes. But Rachel Marsden puts it this way: spare me the stories of your genius, tech-savvy child who can name every country on Google Earth, or how because of your iPhone, BlackBerry, or 3 cell phones, you juggle 20 tasks at once and never miss any business, even at 4 a.m., because you sleep with your portable devices. Does anyone care that technology is destroying social graces and turning people into rude jerks? Thought that was kind of interesting. That was written a couple of years ago because obviously we've updated some of that as well. But there has been this ongoing concern about even the impact that some of this might be having on our families and our children. And one of the people that we've interviewed on this program on Point of View a number of occasions is Rebecca Hagelin. And she has talked about the fact that narcissism has sort of picked up and actually begun to creep into our world. And so she's also written about this as well in an article that was talking about this, said young people spend hours every day updating their Facebook pages, post and email countless pictures of themselves, plug their ears with music to create a self-indulgent experience shut off from everyone around them. So those are just a few of the warnings before we get into some of the things we talk about in this booklet on social media, because we all have the sense that it might be a little bit excessive in terms of the amount of time that sometimes young people and even adults spend in that regard. But let's, if we can, go into a little more of the actual studies that have been done. And before I get into the heavy studies, let me just start by saying that one of the interesting ways to get into this conversation is to look at some of the material put together by Nicholas Carr. He began to wonder whether or not social media was having a profound negative effect even on himself. And so he wrote an article in Atlantic entitled, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And he said, I observed over the past few years that I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. And he believed this came from using the internet. And of course, he used the word Google, but he could have said Twitter, Facebook, anything else. But that's what he did when he wrote that article in Atlantic. That particular article connected with so many people that he then went on to continue his research and produced a book which is entitled The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. And what he does in the book, and it's one that actually Nick Pitts and I have quoted from on a regular basis, he took the time to survey a lot of the brain research that has helped us to understand why we don't read as much as we used to, and why it seems to be harder for us to concentrate. And a lot of that gets down to a word that I've used on this program before, but it's worth repeating, and that is the brain reprograms itself. It is using what's called neuroplasticity. Now, that's a good thing. I mean, if you have a stroke in one part of your brain, you have an injury in one part of your brain, it's amazing that our just phenomenal brain structures are able to remap themselves sometimes in pretty significant ways, develop other neural connections. And so this can be a very positive thing, but it also is a negative in the sense that these digital devices perhaps are actually remapping our brain, because if you use it, you'll keep it, but if you don't use it, you'll lose it. And so one of the things he says is that also we have difficulty concentrating because we sort of programmed our brains to only pay attention for a short period of time. One of his quotes is, Once I was a scuba diver in a sea of words. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski. And one of the other quotes that I put in this book comes from one of the developmental psychologists at Tufts University. Said, we are not only what we read, we're how we read. And that is the style of reading that we've developed with our iPhones, our iPads, our computers, going to various sites like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, as well as using Google. In some respects, put an emphasis on efficiency and immediacy. And so as a result, it's sort of changed the way we read and changed the way we actually acquire information. And as I said, we know a little bit more about this now because you have these incredible brains. In some respects, we've said that one of the most really complex organs in the universe is right between your ears, 100 billion neurons inside your skull. They can break connections, they can form connections, and the argument has been, well, this has only happened to young people. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Hate to tell you, that's not the case. It's even reprogramming, if you will, the brains of adults. One neuroscientist at George Mason University said the brain has the ability to reprogram itself on the fly, altering the way it functions. And so let's, if we can, talk about a couple of issues before we take a break. One is the issue of concentration. In the booklet, I quote from Stephen Kotler. He wrote a very helpful article and a little bit concerning article in Psychology Today, and he used the same kind of phraseology. His was, how Twitter makes you stupid. Because he said he once asked the author of a best-selling book why he called it the 8-minute meditation. And the author told him, well, because 8 minutes is the length of an average segment in television, and he reasoned that most of us can only maybe pay attention for 8 minutes. Well, Stephen Kotler took that to its extreme and said, if that's the case, by reading more and more Twitter posts, this is back when Twitter was 140 characters, he said could be reducing our time of concentration to 140 words or 140 characters. And so the point he's making is that he even concluded that if you took a Twitter-addicted teen and gave them a reading comprehension test, their comprehension levels would plunge once they passed the 140-word mark. So this is, again, just one of those issues of concentration. And so people oftentimes convince themselves that they can multitask. But in the book, I also point out something very interesting, and that is you really are not multitasking. We now, through various kinds of brain studies, recognize that what you are actually engaged in is what psychologists and neurophysiologists call continuous partial attention. And so you have all probably at one time or another been in a room where somebody's supposedly listening to you or in a meeting, but they're paying attention to their digital device. And they'll say, oh, I'm multitasking. No, they're just jumping back and forth between what they think they're concentrating on. And because we've done so many brain scans and maps, we recognize that a person is kidding themselves to really think that they are multitasking. One of the last things we talk about in here is also this issue of addiction. And just before we take a break, let me just mention that that is something which we can very easily document just by our own experience. Take a digital device away from your teenagers right now and watch them go into withdrawal. And I've told the story on this program before, but it's worth mentioning again that one of my colleagues who's written some of these books on technology actually has taught a course in technology for a number of years at the University of Texas at Dallas. And what he has found is that these students are so addicted that when he has this one requirement in the class for you to have, if you will, a digital fast, which means you get to hand over your smartphone to him. He puts it in a drawer for 2 days. There, first of all, are a lot of students that will not do it because they can't even imagine spending more than an hour away from their phone, much less 2 days without their phone. And then for those that do, by the time they come in on that second day, they're almost sweating because they just cannot even imagine what it would be like to have to go any longer without that smartphone. And if those aren't signs of addiction, I don't know what is. And George Barna has a very good article that came out a number of years ago about smartphone addiction, in which he said if you look at the criteria for addiction of various substances and see the characteristics, you see the same kind of phenomenon for people in social media. So when we come back, I'm going to have a couple other quick comments about the impact of social media. Then we're going to move into this whole issue of social media censorship. All that coming up right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again talking about social media for a number of reasons. First of all, it's something that affects you day to day. It certainly affects your children and grandchildren. I want to give you some facts and figures and information. This booklet on social media is available to you. And one of the things that I think you've already learned from our discussion is just to pay attention to the amount of time that you spend in front of digital devices, whether you're an adult or a child. And again, I quoted a while back from the individual that wrote the book, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, Nicholas Carr. At one point he says, it reminded him of the 2001 Space Odyssey, where they begin to disconnect the memory circuits of that runaway computer, Hal. And Hal says at one point, Dave, my mind is going. I can feel it. I can feel it. And interesting enough, Nicholas Carr says the same thing. I can feel it, too. Over the past few years, I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. And so, again, this is one of the reasons why, from a Christian point of view, I think we should really make sure that we're not being conformed to this world, which is a warning that Paul gives to us in Romans 12:2, and that we should not be taken captive by false philosophies, another warning that Paul gives us in Colossians 2:8, but instead we should focus on those things which are true and honorable and just and pure and lovely, commendable, excellent, worthy of praise, as we see in Philippians 4:8. But that brings us to the whole issue of social media censorship, and this is not a new topic for those of us on Point of View. You might remember many years ago, Craig Parshall, who at that time was the vice president of the National Religious Broadcasters, who actually began what was called the John Milton Project for Religious Free Speech. He was more recently on the program with us saying that he's even revived some of that because they had been monitoring what was happening. And back then, they were talking about free speech, liberty of citizens who use the internet is nearing a crisis point. Well, back then, the stories were not that difficult. They had to do with, for example, Governor Mike Huckabee called for a Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day, and Facebook took it down, but then got a little bit too much controversy, so they put it back up. There were an occasional YouTube video on abortion that was taken down. Lila Rose, probably the one that was affected by that most. But more recently, talk about affecting videos. Dennis Prager's PragerU has at least, I think it's about half of the videos. These are 5-minute videos that maybe aren't taken down, but they're put in a restricted area. And so that is the case. Of course, we years ago talked about how Apple took down the iPhone app for the Manhattan Declaration only because it talked about life and marriage, and that was seen as bad. But now you can see how there has been even much more monitoring of some of those actions. So if you would like to find a previous issue of Outlook magazine, that one came out June of last year, June of 2018. And in there we talk about some of the testimony at that time by Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, which I thought was kind of interesting because most of the testimony had to do with data collection and privacy. But to the credit of at least 2 U.S. senators, they raised a few other things. First of all, Senator Ted Cruz raised very good questions back then about a pervasive pattern of bias and political censorship. And in just a minute, I'm going to quote from a more recent Senate hearing in that regard. And Senator Ben Sasse also raised the question about whether America might be better off not being policed by one company that has a really big and powerful platform. So we talked about some of that a year ago, and let me now kind of update that because in a recent Senate hearing, you had Senator Marsha Blackburn, who's a senator from Tennessee, who said during her 2018 campaign they pulled one of her particular ads because it had a pro-life theme, and Twitter deemed it as inflammatory. Now, to be fair, when the representative from Twitter was there, he did apologize to her and said they had made a mistake on your ad. But then shortly thereafter, you have Senator Ted Cruz had this big poster. You can see this on some of the web pages that have been posted on this. It was an ad done by our friends at Susan B. Anthony, and it showed a picture of Mother Teresa. And then across it, he had the word censored because they used a quote from Mother Teresa about the fact that abortion is anti-woman. So you've had some of those kinds of things. Then, of course, you had various commentators that have been banned from Facebook, and many of those are individuals that, quite frankly, we don't have on this program. We don't necessarily agree with them. They may be a little too extreme. They might travel and deal with conspiracies that we don't necessarily think are wise. But when you start pulling out people that almost all of us would have some problems with, it makes it a lot easier to pull out others like us from Facebook. You've had others like Stephen Crowder's YouTube channel, which has been demonetized, and others are starting to do that. And as I said, about 24 PragerU videos have been slapped with this restrictive label. So it takes only a little bit of time to see how dangerous this might be. So the point I'm making, and the point we make in this particular article on big tech censorship is that these individuals are fairly powerful. And if you don't believe that, one of the studies that came out the other day, and I have every reason to believe it, shows that Google controls about 90% of the internet searches worldwide. Now, your argument could be, well, there's no non-economic reason why you couldn't start an alternative to Google, and there's Bing and a variety of others that are out there, but, this is where all the players are. When you look at some of the internet searches, the smartphone operating systems, the desktop browsers, where digital advertising is, it tends to pretty much land at Google, Facebook, Twitter, as well as Instagram, YouTube. Those kind of are the big tech people. And Senator Ted Cruz in that hearing pointed out the fact that these big tech companies, to use his phrase, is, quote, are larger and more powerful than Standard Oil was when it was broken up, and they are larger and more powerful than AT&T was when it was broken up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that government needs to step in, but nevertheless, that is part of the issue. There are some that have argued, I don't agree with them necessarily, that platform access is a civil right. And if you want to make that a civil right, well, we recognize what a civil right is, and that is you cannot inhibit that. But again, these private companies are oftentimes trying to portray themselves as like an individual that's providing a platform in a public park. That is, I really don't control the content. I'm giving anybody a chance to say anything they want. There may be some limits in terms of you don't want people calling for the overthrow of the government. You don't want people shouting obscenities or doing obscene kinds of things. But by and large, the argument is that they're a public platform. But those that are arguing that platform access is a civil right are saying these are monopolies and they need to be broken up. But the problem with that argument is that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube are private property. And so as a result, they do not necessarily always, like the federal government, have to be governed by the First Amendment. If you are indeed a private company like the Washington Post or the New York Times doesn't have to give you a right to post your op-ed on their page. Even if you write a letter to the editor, they don't have to post your letter to the editor on the newspaper because they are what? A private company. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about where that gets a little bit more difficult, because if indeed they're a public square, then they also seem to be censoring certain individuals and really paying attention to the content of certain individuals. And yet at the same time, they're being treated from a legal and political point of view as if they're a public square. And that goes back to something I'll talk about after the break, the 1996 Communications Decency Act. and what could or should happen in terms of that. So again, we're talking today about a biblical point of view on social media. We spent most of our first half of this discussion on the influence of the media. Now I want to talk a little bit more about social media censorship and what government can do and what we as individuals should do in terms of expressing our opinions in that regard. And so we will continue to, of course, monitor this at Point of View, but at the same time, we want to educate you about some of the issues that are on the table in terms of social media censorship. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation. And again, if you want some more information, you can find some of it, of course, on our website, pointofview.net, but we also have it in this little booklet on social media. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to know a little bit more about this topic, again, we are making available this booklet on social media. But let's again talk about this idea of social media censorship. And the first issue, as we pointed out, is a lot of these so-called big tech companies. We're talking about Google and Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and others are private companies. And so private companies certainly are governed in a much different way than, say, a publicly held company. And so if you want to publish something or not publish something, you have that freedom. And more importantly, you also are held responsible for what an individual publishes. In other words, if indeed you're just an open forum, a good example is a free speech platform in a public park. If later you disagree with something that is said, or somebody says something libelous or slanderous from that platform, you can't sue the city or the park. They didn't know what the person was going to say. It's a public arena. They can say whatever they want. They can be sued, but you can't sue the individual that provided the platform. And that's been the argument of Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube and those, because they're saying we're just providing a platform. But that's not exactly true, as we've just pointed out. They are also looking at and evaluating content. And now we have the Veritas Forum videos that are showing to us as well that some of the individuals in these companies are wanting to do what they can, not only to advance certain ideas, but even advance certain candidates, including presidential candidates. Which brings us back to a decision that was made during the Clinton administration, which I agreed with at the time. I think I still agree with it, but it's something to think about, and that is the 1996 Communications Decency Act actually has a section in there that actually protects these platforms from any kind of liability, because they recognize that this would be crippling to the advancement of the internet, and the internet has done very well because it's been protected up until now in those regards. And so there are some individuals that are saying maybe we should withdraw that particular section of the Communications Decency Act. Maybe we should encourage government to take a closer look. This is why a lot of us around the table are a little bit wary of that, because once you have the government being empowered to patrol social media platforms, it reminds us a little bit of another very important piece of legislation that was eventually removed, but one that really, in some cases, tended to do more harm than good. And that was the 1949 FCC Fairness Doctrine. It was something that ostensibly was to force media outlets to provide content that was fair, that it was honest, it was balanced. But the bottom line is oftentimes what it did was tend to stifle those ideas. And frankly, talk radio and other forms of media exploded once first the FCC Fairness Doctrine was ignored, and eventually under the Reagan administration was removed. And so in some respects, that's why people, including some of us around the table, oftentimes have a little bit of a question about whether or not the government should step in as well. Another aspect of that I talk about in the booklet is even if the government were to regulate content on social media platforms, I think it's worth mentioning, as I say in here, that some of those companies would probably have a lot of influence. Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, don't you think they'd probably have a place at the table in terms of how the government drafts various kinds of media regulations? And it could be done in such a way that it actually gives even more of a competitive advantage to things like Facebook and Twitter and a variety of other social media platforms. So that's another reason why it's certainly of concern. And so some have suggested we might even talk about closing down our social media accounts, because the argument, I think legitimately, if you don't like the way the New York Times or the Washington Post report stories, you don't have to subscribe to those newspapers. If you don't like how either MSNBC or Fox News or anybody covers stories, you don't have to tune into that TV network. And so in some respects, those kinds of choices are being made as well. So one individual in particular said, delete your Facebook yesterday. Don't get your news from Twitter. The issues of free speech on social media will no longer matter to you. They don't matter to me. I've made a decision not to subjugate myself to the whims of our new overlords. And that kind of brings us back to a point I made earlier, and that is this issue of media addiction. Whether you decide to close down your media account or not, whether you want to keep your social media account or not have it, it seems to me that all of us, whether we're adults or children, need to recognize this real concern about what we call media addiction. George Barna, as I mentioned earlier, concluded that media exposure has become America's most widespread and serious addiction. And I remember when he first posted that, I thought, yeah, everything's an addiction. But he really convinced me in the article, because he says if you go back and look at the criteria that is used to evaluate whether somebody is addicted, or those criteria that have been established by the American Psychiatric Association, you can see that fits pretty well. And we also have documented in this hour that addictions could change your brain structure, can alter your emotions, your motivations, and your concentration. Oh, does that just sound like what we just talked about in terms of social media? Yes, it does. It's not as serious as what LSD or cocaine or marijuana might do, but I think, again, you can recognize that some of these characteristics are the case. And more importantly, if nothing else, as we wind down this particular hour, I just want to especially have those of us that are parents and grandparents pay attention to this digital generation. Those young people that were growing up in the media generation, that would be the so-called Generation Y, or oftentimes called millennials, certainly entered into a time of media. But the next generation, the so-called Generation Z, those are oftentimes referred to as the iGen generation, they're digital natives. They grew up with digital devices. At 2 years old, they might have had an iPad on their laps to play games. And so in some respects, this is, I think, all the more reason for us to begin to reevaluate how many hours a week young people, especially very young people, spend in terms of media. And it's interesting, George Barna points out that about 3/4 of parents say that exposure of their children to inappropriate media content is one of their top concerns. But if you go back and ask the question, well, how do they have access to that media? You're the one that turned on the TV set. You're the one that gave them a digital device. You're the one that gave them video games. Maybe you're the one that should be paying attention to this as well. And one final point, for those of you that are in church ministry, I just hope that there would be a time in which you, if you're a pastor, a Sunday school leader, a Bible fellowship leader, or somebody like that, that you would just simply take the time to maybe address this issue as well. And again, if you want some of the resources, my book, Arts, Media, and Culture, we have one on technology and social trends. And of course, this free booklet we are making available, Biblical View on Social Media, is something that we would want to put in your hands so that maybe you could get others in your sphere of influence, your congregation, your small group, or just merely your family, to begin to think about how to apply biblical principles to this. So anyway, as we wind down our discussion of social media, let me one more time encourage you to get a copy of this book on social media. You can contact us at www.pointofview.net, or you can write to us. The address is simple, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. Well, thank you for listening to this hour-long discussion right here on Point of View on social media.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This is our Monday program, and I might just mention that it is also our 4th of July week. So probably on Wednesday, just before the 4th of July, I might even do a program, if we have some time, talking a little bit about our nation's godly heritage. So those will be some things that we'll be talking about. And we are supposed to be talking with Michelle Bachman, and we will do so when we make connection with her. But let me just say that we just ended yesterday the actual fiscal year end, and of course essentially we ended any kind of conversation about it on Friday, which was June 28th. And so first of all, I want to say thank you for those of you that helped us meet that matching challenge for our fiscal year end. Now, the best we can determine, we're going to have to wait a few more days to see what comes in through the mail to see if we've reached our overall goal, but looks like maybe we're close, so we'll see where that takes us, and I'll give you a full accounting a little bit later, if not the end of this week, because that's only 2 days from now, and sometimes the mail takes a little longer to get here, but we'll see if we can give you an update, if not this week, certainly next week. And so we just want to, again, thank everyone to help meet our matching challenge, and just encourage you to continue to support Point of View, especially, as I mentioned, during the summer months. That's when it's a little bit more difficult. Since Michelle Bachman's not here, let's go to the first article I've posted, and it is entitled, "Bernie Sanders Won the Debate. He may not be the nominee, but he has set the Democratic agenda." I had this sitting on my desk, and my wife said, "Does everybody think Bernie Sanders won the debate?" I said, no, read the subtitle. The subtitle is not that he won the debate. I don't think anybody thought Bernie Sanders won the debate. But the point they're making, at least at the Wall Street Journal, is the ideas of Bernie Sanders have won the day. And this is how the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal put it. President Trump is a lucky man. Typically, a re-election campaign is a referendum on the incumbent, and Donald Trump is losing that race. Not sure about that, but okay. I'll leave it for their assessment there. But the Democrats are moving left so rapidly that they may let him turn 2020 into a choice between his policy record and the most extreme liberal agenda since 1972, which then they said, which may be unfair to George McGovern. Those of us that are old remember that when George McGovern ran against Richard Nixon, he won his home state and nothing else, because at that time, in 1972, George McGovern and the McGovern wing of the Democrat Party were feeling its oats and were going very far left. But nevertheless, the point that the editors are making is, after watching 2 nights of the debates that took place, Wednesday night and Thursday night, they conclude, and now I'll quote back from them, the party hasn't merely moved to the left of Bill Clinton's New Democrats in the 1990s. Democrats have moved to the left of where they were in 2010 when they last ran the government. Bernie Sanders lost to Hillary Clinton in 2016, but he has won the ideological debate. Which, by the way, before I go on, because this has some really good material in it, and I would encourage you to read it. Some of you may already subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, but if you don't, one of the things that we try to do is post one of these articles, which if you went out on the internet, you couldn't find it because it would be blocked because you have to have a subscription. Well, I have a subscription, so I wanted to at least pass that part on to you. And it's very well written, but it also, just before we even get to the other facts in this article, makes a point that I've said so many times, that I hear various commentators say both parties have become more radical. And I'm going, no, they haven't. As a matter of fact, when we get Michelle Bachmann on here, I'll see if she agrees. But you can look at a Republican Party platform for 2000, 2008, really any of those, and say, really, if anything, the 2016 one, because Donald Trump won and pulled back on a couple of issues, maybe isn't even as conservative as the 2008 platforms. But you can go back, as they just mentioned a minute ago, and just even try to compare this party platform in the Democratic Party that will come out to the one in 2016, or like you said, go back and compare the Democrat Party platform when Bill Clinton was running in 1992, and you will see the most remarkable shift that ever has been seen. So if anything, it has been the tremendous movement of the Democrat Party generally, not all Democrats. I know some of you listening right now are saying, I haven't changed. Yeah, I understand that. But I'm talking about some of the leadership and some of the Democratic presidential candidates have done so. And to go back to the editorial written by the Wall Street Journal, they said that, again, Bernie Sanders' vision of America relentlessly is dividing by class, race, and gender. Supposedly women live in Handmaid's Tale, minorities in pre-civil rights South. And the question they ask is, do they think Americans don't remember that an African-American president was elected president, and so were his two attorney generals? But nevertheless, the point they're making is, and this is the list that I will go into in a little more detail after the break. Let me just take one now before we go to the break. And that is, they say that Elizabeth Warren has endorsed Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill, which would abolish private insurance for 177 million Americans. So is Kamala Harris, Senator Kamala Harris, though she now seems to be hedging, says she'd allow private insurance for supplementary coverage. Most of the other candidates, they say, favor expanding the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, with a public option or a government-run plan that would compete with private insurance. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand said she would move us to a single payer more quickly. She may be right, they say, as well. But now her view, if you will, is considered kind of the moderate party position on that. So when we come back from the break, what we want to do is we'll look at some of these other issues. And I think you're going to find not only in this editorial that appeared from the Wall Street Journal, but also from some of the commentaries I have coming out next week. And I'll read some parts of it ahead of time just to give you a kind of a preview, that we have seen a remarkable shift in the Democratic Party in this particular year of 2019. And there is no reason to believe that that will change as these candidates run for the presidency in 2020. One of those candidates I just mentioned is probably going to be the nominee. I would venture to say that it could be someone other than those names I just mentioned. It's doubtful, but after all, who 4 years ago would have thought that Donald Trump not only would be the nominee, but would also be the president? So I'm always withhold final judgment and should be allowed to make final adjustments later on. But I'm pretty sure that one of those names I just mentioned, or two or three others, are the likely candidates. And the positions they hold right now are, as they point out, further to the left of where Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were in 1992, and really further to the left of where even the Democratic Party was in 2010, the last time they were indeed running the government. And so it shows you a tremendous shift, and I think you're going to see a major shift even from 2016 to 2020. Let's come back and count the ways. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The current showdown with Iran brought lots of commentary. At times like this, lots of people become instant foreign policy experts. I don't claim to be one of them, but I do know that some of the comments being made are off track. I've read pundits trying to argue that Iran is not our enemy and isn't a threat to us. Some have argued that the principal reason for Iranian belligerence is due to the fact that last year the Trump administration withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often referred to as the Iran nuclear deal. While that may be true, consider some of the incidents between Iran and the U.S. that precede the government's decision to pull out of the nuclear deal. Back in 1979, angry mobs stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days until the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. Iran was also behind the attack of the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in 1983 that killed more than 300 Marines while they slept. And in 1988, when Iran tried to disrupt the flow of oil, they placed mines in the Persian Gulf, leading to the damage of an American ship. President Reagan ordered Operation Praying Mantis and was able to sink 6 Iranian ships. More recently, the Pentagon reported that they estimated that Iran was directly responsible for the deaths of at least 600 U.S. soldiers in Iraq. Unless you think this is merely a partisan issue, both 2016 presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, described Iran as the world's chief sponsor of terrorism. And the State Departments of the last 2 administrations have also come to the same conclusion. We may disagree about how to respond to Iran, but let's at least admit that this is a nation where people in the streets chant death to America. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hope you're having a good Monday, and if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. One of the articles I'm putting on the table here is one that's entitled, Bernie Sanders Won the Debate. And again, the subtitle, he may not have been the nominee and probably will not be. I think you can say that with virtual certainty. But he has set the Democrat agenda. And the point they are making, the editors are making, is that when you look at an issue like Medicare for All, that was an outlier issue. 4 years ago, when Bernie Sanders introduced what today is called Medicare for All, he called it something else back then. Can't quite remember what it was. But nevertheless, he was oftentimes at the podium by himself. The last time, about a year ago, he made this presentation on this piece of legislation, he was surrounded by 16 other members of the U.S. Senate, all Democrats. So 17 individuals there at the podium presenting Medicare for All. And again, those would include some of those senators I just mentioned a minute ago. Kamala Harris and Kirsten Gillibrand and Cory Booker and of course Elizabeth Warren and of course Bernie Sanders, to mention just a few, who are, by the way, all presidential candidates. So again, this is something that is interesting, and what is so striking that, with the exception maybe of Joe Biden, most of the other candidates say that Obamacare is inadequate. He will say it's inadequate, but we need to build on it. The rest of them say, we just need to scrap it. It's not working. Of course, we all knew it wasn't going to work anyway. But then we can implement what we need to do, and that is Medicare for All. Well, then the editors go on to talk about some other issues. And I thought it was kind of interesting because one of those, they say, for example, is climate change is now an urgent crisis that demands eliminating not merely the coal industry, but all fossil fuels. And that brings me to a commentary that will be airing next week, in which I point out that this might end up being what I call the climate politics trap. Now, what do I mean by that? It is very clear, after watching these debates last week, that most of these Democrat presidential candidates believe that their number one issue is climate change. Some have said it is the issue for them. Others have said, well, it's one of the most important. They might put it in the top 2 or 3. And so you can see why that would be high on their agenda. First of all, they believe it's an existential crisis, but also politicians also tend to pay attention to polls. And there was one CNN poll that came out that showed that 96% of Democrats say they believe it's important that these candidates support taking aggressive action to slow the effect of climate change. And so, if nothing else, this is a good example of the fact that they feel a tremendous urgency. And, of course, you can see why they would make that a high priority when you have an overwhelming percentage that want action. Well, interestingly enough, I suggest this might end up being a climate politics trap because, yes, most Americans are concerned about climate change, especially Democrats, but there are other polls that remind us that those same Americans don't really want to pay too much to solve the problem. Rich Lowry had a piece that came out a while back in which he talked about the climate trap and pointed out that if you look at one of these Associated Press University of Chicago polls, it asked how much Americans would be willing to pay to fight climate change. A majority, 57%, said, well, at least $1 a month. $1 a month? What? You can't buy a Starbucks for $1. I mean, what? I mean, this shows me just exactly why this could be a trap. And that is, you've got to understand, as we've talked about before, that people say, yes, we want to deal with climate change, but we don't want it to affect our pocketbooks. And when we were here on Friday, remember the comment, if you happen to be listening, by Dr. Merrill Matthews about what happened in France. And that is where Macron decided that it was time to hike the prices for gas and diesel in order to reduce carbon emissions. What happened next? Well, you had the yellow vest protests, the riots, and eventually he had to put his tail between his legs and reverse the policy. So I think what you're going to face real quickly with some of these kinds of issues is that any serious attempt to actually deal with climate change is going to be costly to Americans on the front end immediately, and any benefit that you might get, which I think is going to be slim and none, as we've talked about on this program before, is going to be so far in the distant future that this may actually hurt those candidates, assuming, of course, they win the presidency and are able to implement that. So one of those that they talk about is climate change is now an urgent crisis that demands eliminating not merely the coal industry, but all fossil fuels. Another one they have here is enforcing immigration laws that were once passed by bipartisan majorities in Congress are now called inhumane. Joe Biden is attacked because the Obama administration deported millions of undocumented migrants. And then also another one, for free health care for Americans isn't enough. Now it must be an entitlement for any foreign migrant who enters the United States. And that brings me to another conversation that we had last week and also in one of my commentaries. If indeed we have this ongoing debate in the 2020 election, one of those debates will be, what does it mean to be an American citizen? That sounds like a pretty obvious question, right? Not necessarily anymore, because most of the presidential candidates have a different definition of what it means to be a citizen. Let's start with some basics. First of all, in order to be a naturalized citizen in America, you must demonstrate English proficiency, and you need to pass a citizenship exam. Most Americans think that makes sense. You know, you should have some fluency in being able to read and write English, and you should have some kind of knowledge of civics in order to appreciate America and its history. But a number of these candidates, like Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke, certainly want to completely eliminate the U.S. citizenship exam. Well, okay, what about those individuals from other countries who cross our border without permission or who overstay their visas? What do we call those individuals? Most importantly, should that action be considered a crime? Well, a majority of these candidates, and you can add some that I just mentioned, but Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Elizabeth Warren, go down that long list, don't think it should be a crime. Most of them believe they should be allowed to stay in this country and even have a pathway to citizenship. And as I just mentioned, that may or may not require English proficiency or a basic knowledge of America. And how should we even know if somebody is here illegally? Well, there's two ways you could think about it. One is you could use what's called E-Verify, which is something that has been used by various companies. But a number of the candidates I just mentioned, and add to that as well, people like Bill de Blasio and Kirsten Gillibrand, want to prevent the federal government from even using E-Verify. Well, there's another way you could find out if they're citizens. That's to ask them. But, Bernie Sanders says that asking a question about your citizenship on the census would be absolutely bigoted language. John Hickenlooper says the question about asking whether you're a citizen on the census is corrupt and illegal. And, of course, this is more of a hypothetical because, as we mentioned last week, the Supreme Court ruled that the census cannot have a citizenship question on it as well. So just a couple more on the list here. College loans must be forgiven in part or whole. Tuition now must be free. I love this one. Taxes must be raised to rates unheard of since the 1960s because, as New York Mayor Bill de Blasio put it, money is just in the wrong hands. Another one, the Electoral College must be killed to save American democracy. The Supreme Court must be packed with more justices because the left now sometimes loses some of those decisions. And you can go through this long list, but it is just a reminder that anybody that has not noticed that the Democrat Party has moved remarkably to the left, and that in a sense, Bernie Sanders in some ways has won the day in terms of the ideology, hasn't been paying attention to what is taking place. So we're going to take a break. When we come back, if we have a chance to connect up with Michelle Bachmann, we will do so. If not, we'll get into some other issues, but I've put a few things on the table. So what are your thoughts? Do you think the Democrat Party has moved too far to the left? Do you think that is going to have an impact on the election? Let's open up the phones and give you a chance to express your opinion. The Point of View program is there for you to express your point of view, so I'd like to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join us on air, if you'd like to find this article, it's on our website, pointofview.net. It's the first article. We're going to get to some others right after these important messages.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
We now have an opportunity to hear from our former member of Congress, Michelle Bachmann. And if you are on hold, just wait. We'll get to some of those phone calls a little bit later. Of course, some of you may want to ask her some questions or make some comments. Serves right now as the co-chairperson of the Hammarskjöld and Wallenberg Societies of the United Nations in New York for a Well-Versed Inc. organization. Also, of course, was a former member, as we've mentioned, of the U.S. House of Representatives, represented Minnesota for 8 years, and an individual that also ran for the presidency, participated in 15 different television presidential debates, the only Republican woman in American history to win a presidential contest. And, of course, she and her husband raised 5 biological children and 23 foster children, and joins us now by phone. Michelle Bachmann, always great to have you on the program.
Kirby Anderson, it's always a delight to be on Point of View. Thank you for having me on today.
Well, let me ask the question that I think many people already know, because we've posted an article about some of the things you're doing in the UN. But over the last week, when I've mentioned that you were going to be on Monday, the first question I always get is, well, what's she doing these days? So explain a little bit more, because I'm familiar with that, but a lot of our listeners might say, I've kind of lost track of Michelle Bachmann. What's she doing these days?
Well, it's really a lot of international work. It's work with the nations, and I just have been gone for a month. I was speaking in Ukraine, in Israel, in Greece, in The Hague, and in Amsterdam. And the whole purpose is to bring biblical truth and biblical values around the world. I'm also the co-chair of the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. And what we're doing is going into different nations. We're gathering Christians to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, which the Bible calls us to do. And miraculously, Kirby, God has been opening up one door after another for us to meet with kings, prime ministers, presidents of countries. We've gone in, we've presented the gospel to them, we've asked to pray with them, and we've talked to them about their nation being blessed by blessing Israel. And we talked to them about recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and encouraging them to locate their country's embassy there. We're not doing this as lobbyists for Israel. We're not doing this as lobbyists for the United States. It's really faith-based diplomacy that we're going in to do, and we've seen incredible movement on this front in many nations. We've even gone into Muslim nations, believe it or not, and we've met with the kings, we've met with crown princes to talk with them about their nation blessing Israel. So these are phenomenal doors that have been opening up. Most recently, we were just at The Hague just a few days ago, and that is the center of international law. And while we were there, we had an opportunity to be in the top government building, the building that the Nazis occupied when they first took over the Netherlands. And instead, while we were there, we had a prayer service, a service of reconciliation, and the King of the Netherlands, without anything being planned, sent a special motorcade to pick up the Israeli ambassador. And the next day, the king announced, or the government announced, they would be paying tens of millions of dollars in reparations to the descendants of the Holocaust survivors, who the Holocaust victims who were transferred by the Netherlands train system. These are the kind of miraculous things that we are seeing God do. And so that's a long answer to you. It is faith-based diplomacy that we're doing, not on behalf of any government. We're going in with biblical truth and biblical values and massive amounts of prayer, and we are seeing the hand of God open up doors and bring about solution and reconciliation in ways we never thought possible.
Isn't this exciting? Michelle Bachman with us. And again, we have a link to the website. You can find out a little bit more about this faith-based outreach. Michelle, let's just, since you talked about Israel, talk about that for another minute or two, because, of course, we every other year go to Israel. This year we're going to Israel and Rome. Before we've gone to Israel and Greece. But you have spoken out on this issue before about the value of the United States moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now you're traveling around and encouraging other countries to do so. But it seems to me that that is something that should have been taking place a long time ago. Every other country in the world designates where their particular capital is, and we simply go along with that. But up until recently, we never applied that same principle to Israel, did we?
That's right. And I think that's because there are lies from Satan that have been put forward regarding Israel that are simply not true. And too many politicians have been afraid of standing up to these lies and telling the truth. The present administration is an exception to the history that has gone on before in diplomacy. And instead, the Trump administration has taken the posture of truth. Application of truth, the truth of Israel, the truth of the Palestinian situation. And what Donald Trump has done in terms of putting the United States on a pathway of blessing is like nothing else, because we know that the Bible is true and that Genesis 12:3 is true, that those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. If you look throughout history, that's absolutely been a pattern that has happened. That's historical fact. And now the fact that President Trump has not only recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but has also recognized Jerusalem's sovereignty over the Golan Heights in connection with numerous other decisions that the White House has made. We see that the United States, from an economic point of view, from a foreign policy point of view, in area and arena after area and arena, the United States is overperforming more than we ever have in terms of improvement for the lives of the American people. And God is not partial. What he does for one, he will do for all. So the truth of that word isn't just an American phenomena. It's true for all nations. And I'll give you an example. Guatemala. Guatemala was the second country to recognize Jerusalem as its capital. I had the privilege of being with President Jimmy Morales. I was most recently with his wife in Jerusalem. Since Guatemala made that decision to recognize Jerusalem, their economy has improved by 25% in 1 year. In 1 year, they know without a shadow of a doubt that God blessed their nation. And so this is available for other nations as well, the blessing. And it isn't that God is a vending machine. I don't want to act like that. But I absolutely believe that when we embrace the truth of God's word, we can know that it will be performed. And we are seeing that happen across the globe.
So again, I will bless those who bless you, and that is certainly something we can see out of Genesis 12. Just before I take a break, I know that you've been traveling, so you probably didn't have a chance to watch the Democratic presidential debates Wednesday night and Thursday night, but even so, I'm sure you've heard about them, and if nothing else, recognize the remarkable contrast we would have if indeed one of these particular candidates who becomes the nominee is elected the president. And what are your thoughts about this? You've been through some of these debates on the Republican side. Any thoughts about the Democratic debates that have taken place so far?
I have, and I think all of us were really quite shocked when we saw to a person every candidate on the Democrat debate stage of one of the nights raised their hands and said, yes, they would favor the United States taxpayer paying for the health care benefits of people who have broken American law and who have come into the United States illegally. This is a huge gift that they would be conferring from the American people. There are many, many Americans who struggle to pay for their own health insurance, and they have trouble going to the dentist, going to the doctor, buying prescription drugs, and yet they would put illegal aliens in the front of the line and all health bills would be paid for. That's economic madness. At the end of the day, whether you like a policy or not, this is all a math problem. It's like any one of us. Each one of us has an income. Each one of us has a paycheck. If you don't have the money, you're done. You're broke. And what isn't told on these debate stages is that the American government today is effectively in bankruptcy. So we don't have the money to be able to spend on all these projects. So they stand on the debate stage and they talk about all the new freebies they're going to give away. No one talks about what will happen to our children when the United States goes into bankruptcy and what economic collapse will look like. We see it in Venezuela, but we need to recognize the same thing could happen here in the United States and within our lifetimes.
Yes.
So I think we need to get a grip on reality.
Well, we need to take a break. And again, when people say we're broke, I said, no, we're $22 trillion past broke. But let's take a break. Michelle Bachmann with us for a few more minutes. And maybe when we come back, I'd love to have her tell the story that I heard her tell at the Texas Values Dinner about how she got involved politically, because I think it would be an encouragement to you. You might say, well, who am I to run for office? Who am I to speak out at a city council meeting? I think you'll be encouraged by hearing her story. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, and just privileged to have with us for a few more minutes, Michelle Bachman. And when you hear her, you say she is so articulate and so able to really put forth these ideas. But Michelle, for just a minute, I heard you give your testimony about how you got involved in politics at Texas Values. I've heard some of the story, but I hadn't even heard all of it. But would you mind sharing that? Because I think it would be an encouragement to some of our listeners that say, well, she probably planned on running for the Minnesota legislature and Congress and the presidency. Nothing of the sort, right?
No, not at all. I had no interest in being involved in politics. I had been a federal tax lawyer, but my real goal was to be a full-time mom at home with my kids. And I'd realized my dream of being able to do that. My husband had finished his PhD and he was working full-time. So we had our 5 biological kids at home. We had 4 foster children. The foster children were teenagers. And our biological kids were either homeschooled or in private Christian school. But the state of Minnesota only allowed one option for foster children, and that was public school. So I saw all this nonsense that came home in their backpack. And I decided to get involved and find out what in the world all this was going on in the public schools. And so it was a godly call on my life, and I'd done a tremendous amount of research, and I started traveling around the state of Minnesota explaining to people what was happening in our public schools. Well, we have a caucus state, and what that means is that anybody can show up to determine who will be the candidate to run for public office. And so I really felt the Holy Spirit speaking to me one morning that saying that I should attend my local political caucus. I did. We were supposed to go to a wedding with our little girls in northern Minnesota, and I asked my husband, is it okay if I don't go? And he took the girls up north, and I went to the political convention. And while we were there, people were saying, you know, we can't continue to give the Republican endorsement to our longest-sitting Republican state senator in Minnesota in our district because he no longer is pro-life. He's voting for tax increases. He's for this awful education system program. And people said, somebody's got to take him on. And so people pointed at me and they said, why don't you run? Well, I hadn't even taken a shower that day. I didn't comb my hair. I had no makeup. I had jeans on and a sweatshirt with a hole in it and moccasins on. And I thought if I ever had political ambitions, they'd be dashed if I ever did anything this crazy. And so I didn't want to do it. But then I have to say, quite honestly, the still small voice of the Holy Spirit spoke to my heart and said, are you willing to be a fool for me? And I thought, I am. I'm willing to do it. So I put my name in, and they told me I had to go up on the stage. It was 300 people, and I had to give a 5-minute speech. So I thought, okay, I'll speak about freedom regarding pro-life, freedom regarding taxes, and freedom regarding the education system. So I did that. The senator stood up, and he gave a speech, and I sat down, and they said, would someone from the Bachman campaign go to the counting room? And I thought, what Bachman campaign? There's no campaign. And so I asked a formidable-looking woman sitting next to me, would you go back in there and into the counting room? So she did, and she came back out an hour later, and she'd written in ink on the palm of her hand, and she showed it to me. And I said, well, what is that? And she said, well, you just got 63% of the vote. The threshold was 60%. And in the first ballot, you just won the endorsement to be the Republican to take on the state senator. And no one was more shocked in that auditorium than I was. And so that was it. It was done. I was the endorsed candidate for Senate, and then I had to run in the general election. And so I had no idea what I'd just done. And I called my best friend. We went down to the dock in my town. We got on our knees. We prayed. I went home. I had to face my husband. He came home, and that was the days of answering machines, and he pushed the buttons on the answer machine. People left messages, oh, congratulations, congratulations, because this was a full banner headline on the front page of the Minneapolis paper that I'd won this thing. And so I was hiding upstairs in our bathroom in our house, and he came home and he said, Michelle, is there something you have to tell me? And I told him, that I'd won this endorsement. And it's so funny because he's a marriage counselor. He's a clinical psychologist. And
right.
So it was not happy times in our house for about 3 days after that. And you can't just give back a political endorsement. Once you've been endorsed, that's it. So then I had to figure out, well, how do you run a campaign? What do you do? I didn't know a thing. In fact, that was like my theme. I know nothing, and I can prove it on how to, run for office. So anyway, the bottom line is that this was the longest sitting Republican in Minnesota, and I had to go out and defeat this guy and figure it out. So the first thing we did is form a prayer committee, and then we just did the deal, and I worked extremely hard, and I won, and it was front page news at least 3 times in the paper, that I had done this thing. But when I went in, I was quite serious about it, and the Lord enabled me to accomplish some significant things in Minnesota. And then from there, I went on and ran for the United States Congress, and I took on the Obama administration, particularly on Obamacare. I was kind of their nemesis, you might say. And then I ran for president of the United States in 2012, the first Republican woman to do so in a way where I was actually in televised debates. I was in 15, and then I am the only Republican woman who's ever won a presidential contest. And it wasn't because I ever had any illusions of being in politics or that I even wanted to be president. The only reason I ran for the presidency is I knew that we had to defeat socialized medicine in the United States because the government had just taken over 1/6 of the American economy. And I knew this would be devastating to the future of freedom in the United States. So that's why I did it. And the positive is that the reason why I ran bore fruit, because each of the 7 men had to adopt my position because people in America had wanted to have the United States get out of Obamacare.
Yes.
And that included Mitt Romney, who was our nominee. He also adopted that position. And the Republican Party had to adopt my position of full repeal of Obamacare. So when I left the race, I didn't shed a tear. I felt like I had achieved my mission because the nominee had adopted my stance of full repeal of Obamacare, and the Republican Party platform was adopted,
yes.
Holding that position, and it helped us win elections for the next 2 cycles. So I was grateful.
Great story, and I'm glad you shared that. I know that we got to let you go in just a minute, but again, we have a link to the website, so if people want to pray for you, certainly pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and certainly pray for your outreach. We have that as well, but we have always counted you as a great friend to Point of View. I know you started listening a long time ago, and I certainly appreciate you being on Point of View with us today.
Oh, I started listening when I was 19 years old. I'm serious, and now I'm 63, and it has been so important in my life. I thank you for the ministry of Point of View. You have educated me well over the years, and I'm a huge fan of yours, Kirby. So God bless you. God bless the listeners. And may you have many, many more years of fruitful service in the kingdom.
Well, thank you so very much. That was very sweet. Look forward to the next opportunity to hear from Michelle Bachmann, but we need to take a break. And when we come back, those of you online, we will get to your phone calls. So, by the way, if you have some comments about what Michelle Bachmann had to say, even though she'll have to run on to her next venue, we welcome those phone calls. I have some more things to talk about, including the attacks on a journalist by Antifa, and some of the reaction to that. Also, the way in which certain individuals, if they are perceived as pro-Trump, are being treated horribly in some of these restaurants, and a number of other topics that we'll put on the table. But we'll also get to some of those phone calls. Some of you want to talk about, for example, the riots that took place in France and some of the Democrat candidates. So all of that is fair game. 1-800-351-1212. Michelle Bachmann was with us, but when we come back, we'll be with you and get your comments. So again, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls right after these important messages.
We live
in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Open line if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've had a chance to talk with Michelle Bachmann. We've also talked about one of the articles we posted. Bernie Sanders won the debate. Well, he may not be the nominee, but he has set the Democratic agenda. And in just a little bit later this hour, we'll get into the attack on journalist Andy Ngo, attacked by Antifa, or Antifa, depending on how you want to say it, in Portland. One of the articles I've posted is where Senator Ted Cruz wants people held accountable for the attacks on the journalist. Of course, 3 have been arrested. And also, of course, he's appeared on various programs, including Tucker Carlson's one, where he was attacked. You know, it's so funny because some people say, well, they just threw milkshakes on him. These are the same people that say if you say some naughty words, that's an attack. Well, first of all, yes, he was hit with milkshakes. He was hit with silly string, but he was also punched in the head and bloodied. And the way in which people sort of justify this is amazing to me, but it shows how this is very dangerous, especially in light of another article I'm going to get to in just a minute. FBI investigation of Antifa for plotting to buy guns from the Mexican cartel for an armed rebellion. So this is going to get violent if we don't hold people accountable, and if we allow thugs to walk around with their masks on, throwing things, hitting people. This is amazing. And again, it's been amazing to me that some of the journalists have said, well, he's a conservative journalist, so we won't complain about that. Oh, my gosh. We've got a lot to cover, and we will do so. But let's take some phone calls first. Some of you have taken the time to make a phone call, and some have had to wait a while. So we'll go first to Missouri, listening on the Internet. Randy, what's on your mind and your point of view?
Well, thanks for taking my call. You discussed France and the riots that took place over the gasoline tax.
Sure.
And I'd like to imply that it was also tied in with the immigration issue. They had also simultaneously adopted the United Nations Migrant Compact, which is a mandate to take in a whole bunch more immigrants, and that's what really sent people over the edge, as well as the gasoline tax. It was just underreported in the news. And, of course, France having no say in the matter, even if their leader were to oppose it because of it being a European Union nation. And I'd like to suggest that programs in the United States, like the United Nations Refugee Resettlement Program, which also is a program where we're taking in refugees and giving them housing and setting them up with government benefits and flying them in where they're unvetted and they're not being screened for health. With these open border policy that's taking place at the border, it's really the same issue. We're just not, we have the same policy. It's an open borders policy, as the United Nations. It's in the United Nations Charter, and whether it's the cartels making donations to the Congress, I don't know what the deal is. Our borders are open. They've been open for decades, and the problem's getting worse. And I mean, down in San Antonio right now, you've got refugees that are in quarantine, and nobody knows what they have. But I believe they come from the Congo, and Ebola is an issue. So who knows what the story is there? But this is the kind of problem we're having, and unless something's done, we're going to have a France situation in this country in the next 4 to 6 years.
Again, you were talking about what we call the Yellow Vest protest. And, of course, the primary issue, like you said, was, of course, the gas and diesel tax, but also immigration, which has been a big issue in France. And, well, as a matter of fact, I say one of the other callers wants to address that issue as well. So we'll stay on that issue of immigration. And let me just take some more phone calls first and give a few more of you a chance to express your point of view. So let's go to the state of Arizona. Sarah, a relatively new point of view listener. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call. I'm 23 years old, and I used to be very involved in politics on the way radical far left, which, as you were saying, has views that are mainstream among Democrats today. When I got the Holy Ghost, the Lord opened my eyes to many truths, mainly the general moral decline of the country, which I used to advocate for before God changed my heart and mind. So, and when Christ found me, I started to focus on God's kingdom, but I still have major concerns about what happens in this country politically. And I just want to say thank you to your radio program because it's really refreshing and appreciated. And thank you to God as well.
Well, I appreciate you calling, and I hope you'll keep listening and let us know a little bit more about your, if you will, kind of spiritual pilgrimage and political pilgrimage. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes I have people that listen to this program for the very first time and call in. I say, well, just give it a little more time. You know, you've only heard 1 hour of the program. Listen to it for a couple of days, listen to it for a couple of years. And one of those examples we just mentioned a minute ago, Michelle Bachman started listening to this program and she was 19. She didn't tell you the rest of the story, but I happen to know the story, and that is at the time she was dating Marcus, who became her husband. And Marcus and his family had a tradition back when Marlon Maddox was the host of this program, and they would take a late lunch because they were on the farm, and so usually from about 1 to 3 they would, or at least from 1 to 2 during lunch, they'd listen. Sometimes they stay around because it was so interesting. So if you were enjoying that family, you had to go and eat lunch with them at that hour and had to listen to Marlon Maddox on the program and Point of View. So really, since she was 19 years of age, she's been listening to this program, Point of View. She's been a great friend, and that shows you the impact that Point of View has had on her life. Let's, if we can, also get another conversation going with our friend in Illinois, WPEO. Sue, what's your point of view today?
Hi, Kirby. I really appreciate your program. You cover so many good things, but today especially because I'm a senior citizen, and this is not the world I grew up in. The Democrats, no matter what the conservatives do, are against it, and their interest is in killing babies, and I really believe that. And it's just so against my faith and my principles, and I don't know how. I mean, I'm going to have to answer for my own things when I get to heaven, but I can't imagine having to say I killed my baby. Yes. I just can't imagine that. And also the immigrants. I mean, I understand that they don't have a place to go, evidently, but we cannot take the world on. We cannot, we don't know what kind of diseases they have. We don't know a lot about them. Well, I guess we do probably know a lot, but it's just that United States can't be the savior of the world. Jesus Christ is. And I just don't know how we can continue to support all these things and the diseases and things that they bring. And then they talk about letting them go out of jails and stuff, and then they go out and rape the same people. I mean, I heard this right on television, and I meant, you got to care about your own people, too.
Well, again, I wouldn't bring people in this country. We have more jobs than we have people to fill those jobs, but I'd like to have an orderly way of bringing individuals in and being able to vet them, because for every one person that does something evil, there are probably 100 that are here just simply because they want to experience the American dream. But you need to have some kind of orderly process. I think you've got a good point. We'll take some more phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The current showdown with Iran brought lots of commentary. At times like this, lots of people become instant foreign policy experts. I don't claim to be one of them, but I do know that some of the comments being made are off track. I've read pundits trying to argue that Iran is not our enemy and isn't a threat to us. Some have argued that the principal reason for Iranian belligerence is due to the fact that last year the Trump administration withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often referred to as the Iran nuclear deal. While that may be true, consider some of the incidents between Iran and the U.S. that precede the government's decision to pull out of the nuclear deal. Back in 1979, angry mobs stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days until the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. Iran was also behind the attack of the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in 1983 that killed more than 300 Marines while they slept. And in 1988, when Iran tried to disrupt the flow of oil, they placed mines in the Persian Gulf, leading to the damage of an American ship. President Reagan ordered Operation Praying Mantis and was able to sink 6 Iranian ships. More recently, the Pentagon reported that they estimated that Iran was directly responsible for the deaths of at least 600 U.S. soldiers in Iraq. Unless you think this is merely a partisan issue, both 2016 presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, described Iran as the world's chief sponsor of terrorism. And the State Departments of the last 2 administrations have also come to the same conclusion. We may disagree about how to respond to Iran, but let's at least admit that this is a nation where people in the streets chant death to America. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Take some more phone calls, but in just a few minutes, I do want to talk about the reaction from especially the more radical left, Antifa and others, but not necessarily just them, of shunning, shaming, doxing, and attacking. Of course, the attack on this journalist, but then I want to broaden it because Byron Yark has a whole section in one of his recent Washington Examiners about how if you are identified as a conservative, identified as a Christian, or even identified as a pro-Trump individual, how that has taken a very threatening turn. So we're going to focus on some of that in just a minute. But let's take another phone call. We'll go to California, listening on KYCC. Leslie, thank you for joining us today.
Hi. Last night I listened to Mark Levin, and he brought up that the Democrats that are portraying the socialist information that they want for the United States if they get in the office, he took us right to 1936 Constitution of the USSR, Chapter 10.
Yes.
And in all of the articles is verbatim based on what the left socialist Democrat socialists are portraying. Free, and it's very scary. And plus, how are we going to pay for all that if they get in? Because it's very scary.
Well, let me see if I can clarify that, because if I remember right, because I do listen to Mark Levin when I have an opportunity, I think he had made the case, at least initially, and of course I didn't see the one the other night, but initially, that it was really kind of Bernie Sanders that was using that from the Soviet Constitution, which, by the way, is not surprising, because I think we've shared on this program before that Bernie Sanders and his wife actually spent their honeymoon in the Soviet Union. So it's kind of that he established that. And if you take what you just said and then relate it to the first article on our website today from the Wall Street Journal, Bernie Sanders won the debate. And I don't mean that he won the debate in terms of winning it as much as he won the ideas. And so a lot of those ideas that are being espoused by some of these candidates, you would hope that they had studied their history and knew that they're parroting some of the things from the Soviet Constitution. But I also know that some of them maybe haven't even thought about it. They just simply think that these are good ideas. But your point's well taken. I mean, if you want to go back and look at the Soviet Constitution and see some of the claims that were made there and how that parallels some of the things that I suspect will be in the 2020 Democratic platform, the comparison will be incredible. And we'll point those out when the platform is drafted back in July and August of next year. But your point is also well taken. It brings us back to Michelle Bachmann. She was saying, you know, they keep telling us that where's this money coming from? I hear people say that the United States is bankrupt, she said, or it's broke. No, the United States is $20 trillion past broke. Leslie, if you have zero in your bank account, we'd call you broke. If you had zero in your bank account and you owed $22,000 on your credit card, we'd say you're $22,000 past broke. And that's where the federal government is right now. And not one of those Democratic candidates talked about this. To be fair, Donald Trump doesn't talk about it much either. But the point is that's a question that needs to be asked of your liberal friends. Why in the world do you think we would even be able to fund any of these ideas, even if you think they're good ideas, and most of them aren't very good ideas? But I'll turn it back to you.
Well, true. But I watched the Democrat, debate just to get an idea of what's out there, and then to hear the applause from all of these Democrats and approving. Where's the common sense of the, having all these abortions and everything? And where's the common sense of, wait a minute, shouldn't this be wrong? I mean, I used to be naive about politics, and my girlfriend got me involved, and now it's like front runner with me, and it's like very, very scary.
Well, I've said some of the most dangerous people in America are motivated women, especially moms, who are the kind of the mother bears that are saying, I am not going to raise my kids in this environment. We're going to churn this around and change this and recognize that some of these ideas make no sense, and we're going to call them out. So, Leslie, I appreciate you being one of those, and appreciate you calling us today here on Point of View.
Thank you.
Well, let's give a few more of you in just a few minutes a chance to join the conversation. That number, 1-800-351-1212. Let me go to my second article here because I wanted to really identify what is happening. And if you're not familiar, you may have seen this YouTube video. It's really pretty horrific. But yesterday, Senator Ted Cruz called for law enforcement to hold multiple people responsible for the attack by Antifa, however you want to say it. And Antifa's attack was on Andy Go. No, it says NGO. Most English-speaking people pronounce that Vietnamese word no, so I'll just say it that way. But anyway, he was attacked on Saturday. He's a journalist, and this is something that is just really awful because when they talk about hitting him with a milkshake, it was really a quick, dry cement milkshake, number one. Number two, he was punched in the face. His camera was taken. Let me just kind of read the story here before I get to the Ted Cruz piece. But this one that came out points out the fact that he was punched in the head, covered with silly string and eggs, struck with milkshakes. But again, this is not your typical milkshake. And then later, of course, the police department claimed that it was quick-drying cement. His camera equipment was stolen by a member of the group, and believe me, if you took my camera from me, I think I would do more than just walk away. But nevertheless, you can watch the video in which you see this individual in disguise. They wear the masks and everything, pull the camera away from him, sucker punch him, and then he quickly backpedals in retreat. The cloud closes in, covers his head. He's kicked. He's sprayed with silly string, hit with those, cement-drying milkshakes, and pelted with eggs. You also want to be aware, if your kids are nearby, that you're going to hear taunts and profanity on that YouTube video. He makes his way from the street, trying to protect his head from the mob as they come after him. And so this was simply an attempt to try to cover this story, and it again illustrates just the level of attack that is taking place. Now, you can go to some other videos. For example, I'll point out the October 2018 particular video there, where you have individuals, because they were protesting the speaker, Milo Yiannopoulos, at the University of Berkeley, taking place there. And then you can see members of a group also attacking a driver in protest in the shooting of Patrick Kimmons. And, then, of course, you have some of the other videos that you have of them attacking Tucker Carlson's home. So anyway, the article that we've posted here is Senator Ted Cruz wants these multiple people held accountable for the attacks. And we now have from Breitbart, at least the first news I have, of 3 individuals that were arrested. We have their mugshots. We know a little bit more about them. They're actually charged at the moment with second-degree assault, one for also an assault on a public safety officer, another one charged with harassment, which I think is too light a charge, but nobody asked my opinion, and then another one, the charge of a second-degree disorderly conduct and harassment. And so this is kind of what is unfolding right before our very eyes. And for people that say, well, this is just, the right of free speech, I take you now to a very significant article that just appeared recently in the Daily Caller, and it was from an unclassified document that was obtained by the Chicago Tribune. And what it found is that the FBI is now investigating that these anti-fascist activists, really just anarchists, had a plot to buy guns from the Mexican cartel in order to stage an armed rebellion at the southern border. So this is getting to be a little more significant. And a source who provided it to the San Diego Tribune asked the outlet not to publish the 6-page document because the investigation is ongoing. So we don't have access to that. But nevertheless, the outlet also cited 2 additional law enforcement officials who confirmed the news. And the FBI has warned dozens of law enforcement agencies in both the United States and Mexico of this alleged plot. 2 of the men named in the report said the allegations are absurd, but we have an investigation, and we'll see where that takes us. When we come back, though, I want to try to give some of this a little more of a context. Sometimes there's assaults, sometimes there's doxing, sometimes there's shaming. We'll talk about that right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our teams stand strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.org. pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
One of the things we talk about so often here on Point of View is the need for civility. And there seems to be now a call for more and more incivility against anyone that you might disagree with. And that is coming primarily from the left, Although I'll admit there are some on the right, but it's not exactly the ones that are getting the kind of press. And a good way to illustrate this comes from a piece that came out yesterday by Byron York in the Washington Examiner. It's entitled Anti-Trump Fever Takes Threatening Turn. And he says the toxicity of the resistance to President Trump has risen in recent days, with the nation's most respected newspapers publishing rationalizations for denying Trump supporters public accommodation and for doxing career federal employees. If you don't know what doxing is, it's where you give their home phone number, email, whatever it might be, their cell phone number, whatever. While a journalist found himself under physical attack from the so-called anti-fascist group Antifa, which has stepped up to its violent activities since Trump's election. Now, I already talked about the attack on him, and that is, of course, something that I think is unconscionable. And so we're probably going to hear a little bit more about what has happened to this particular individual, and we'll see whether or not Andy No is going to get some kind of restitution, and even whether or not those three individuals that have been actually now charged are going to find themselves in trouble, or whether this is going to be something that the Portland mayor is allowed to have take place. But what has sort of brought this to the head is a piece by Stephanie Wilkinson. You say, I don't know who she is. Well, she was the owner of that restaurant that last year kicked out Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Well, now she's written an op-ed piece, but let me just read the piece by Byron York. You'll get the point. He says the justification for denying public accommodation came from the Washington Post in an op-ed by Stephanie Wilkinson, the owner of a farm-to-table restaurant in Lexington, Virginia. Wilkinson became famous in June of last year when she refused to serve White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders and told Sanders and her family to leave the restaurant. Wilkinson's staff then followed the Sanders group in protest as they tried to find another place to eat. And so, again, the way the mainstream press covered it was, well, this evil Sarah Sanders was kicked out of a restaurant or asked to leave. Well, the story that didn't get covered is then some of the people followed her and were trying to keep her and her family from eating at any restaurant in Lexington, Virginia, because, after all, they're just evil people, and that's good enough. Well, again, let's go back to Stephanie Wilkinson. Stephanie Wilkinson later told the press she ejected Sanders because the Trump administration is inhumane and unethical, and because the Red Hen, which is the name of her restaurant, has certain standards that I feel has to uphold, such as honesty and compassion and cooperation. In her new article, Stephanie Wilkinson discussed the case of the Avery, and that is the trendy bar in Chicago where a waitress recently spat on Eric Trump, the president's son. Wilkinson wrote that the incident, along with her decision to oust Sanders, shows that in the age of Trump, new rules apply in public accommodations. Americans who work for the administration or support the president should stay away. Pretty strong there. Here's one of the things she wrote, quote, if you're directly complicit in spreading hate or perpetuating suffering, maybe you should consider dining at home. The only person I think spreading hate is her right now, but nevertheless, she gets a prominent place in the Washington Post in an op-ed piece. That shows you how much more accepting those kind of ideas are in the mainstream press. Let's continue on. Stephanie Wilkinson noted, quote, no one in the industry condones the physical assault of a patron. So she's trying to at least distance herself a little bit from the individual that decided to spit on the president's son, Eric Trump, but at the same time declared that America should understand that a frustrated person, for example, a restaurant employee, will lash out at the representatives of an administration that has made its name trashing norms and breaking backs. That's her phrase, okay? Americans should accept that such things will happen. Then she goes on to say, if you're an unsavory individual, we have no legal or moral obligation to do business with you. Better to stay home than risk the spit. She used another word, but you get the idea. And, of course, this is supposed to be what we call the hospitality industry. Okay, so that's the justification at the moment for the fact that you should be allowed to kick somebody out of your restaurant if you don't like the fact that they work for an administration that you don't agree with, and you will be allowed to spit on that person if you don't agree with them as well. My argument to our liberal friends out there is, what if it turns around? Let's suppose we have President Kamala Harris, and all sorts of people disagree with her stands on everything from immigration to abortion. Does that mean that anybody in that administration can be kicked out of a restaurant because we disagree with them? Does that mean we have the right to spit on them? After all, they're killing babies. That's a whole lot more than some of the other things that we might be talking about in terms of the Trump administration. But again, the game only gets played one direction, and I think you figured that out by now. Let's take another one then. There's a piece in the New York Times about doxing. And again, doxing is where we reveal the cell phone number, private email number of an individual. This is by Kate Cronin-Furman, an assistant professor of human rights at University College London. This article focused on the treatment of illegal immigrant children in detention centers near the United States and Mexico. So Kate Cronin-Furman discussed the detentions as well as actions by employees of U.S. Customs and Border Protection in terms of the Holocaust and compared it to the genocides in Cambodia and Rwanda. Those, of course, again, our good friend Byron York says, are contexts which most Americans would dismiss as preposterous and offensive, but which Kate Cronin-Furman and the New York Times take seriously because, after all, this is a piece that appeared in what? The New York Times, okay? Her idea is that opponents of the administration should publicly identify and shame any low-level or mid-level Customs and Border Protection employees who care for migrant children. Such workers would be dismayed at being publicly shamed because they are, quote, sensitive to social pressure, she writes, which has been shown to have played a huge role in atrocity commission and desistance of the Holocaust, Rwanda, and elsewhere. The campaign to stop abuses at the border should exploit this sensitivity. She goes on to say, this is not an argument for doxing. It's about exposure of their participation in atrocities to audiences whose opinions they care about. The knowledge, for instance, that when you go to church on Sunday, your entire congregation will have seen you on TV ripping a child out of the father's arms is a serious social cost to bear. The desire to avoid this kind of social shame may be enough to persuade some agents to quit and may hinder the recruitment of replacements. For those who won't or can't quit, it may induce them to treat the vulnerable individuals under their control more humanely. In Denmark during World War II, she says, for instance, strong social pressure, including from churches, contribute to the refusal of the country to comply with Nazi orders to deport its Jewish citizens. Needless, even though she says it was not an argument for doxing, as our friend Byron York says, it's a clear argument for doxing. Which brings us then to the final one, and that is the attack on Andy Ngo, a journalist often associated with the pre-thought cultural publication Quillnet, in a demonstration in Portland at which Trump was a focus of dispute. Antifa fighters beat up and milkshake Ngo, apparently because he was there and was not on their side. The president is not always at the center of such demonstrations, he points out, but Antifa has become an angry and violent fringe group in the resistance. And the point he makes is shunning, shaming, doxing, and attacking. As the 2020 campaign reaches full speed, would it surprise anyone to see all of it increase, and all from people who congratulate themselves for standing against hate? Perhaps our politics will cool down at some point in the future, but not now. Piece by Byron York, and it just reminds us of the number of op-eds and articles now calling for a level of not just verbal resistance, but physical resistance, shunning, shaming, even physical attacks. This is a dangerous world. Be prepared. I'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, since I was talking about what's happening in Portland, Oregon, I might talk about what's happening in Salem, Oregon for just a minute, because if you've not seen this, this is kind of interesting. You've had a situation in Oregon, which is pretty much a democratically controlled state legislature, in which in this particular case, Republicans left in order to deny the Democratic majority a quorum. Let me be real clear. I don't care whether Democrats, who are usually the ones that walk out, or in this case, Republicans walk out. This is not the way to conduct business. If you can't win the debate, take it on the chin, make your case, win or lose. So, again, I'm not arguing for the fact that Republicans have left, in most cases, has been Democrats. If you haven't followed this, you had, for example, in the state of Texas, Democrats left after a while in order to deny first the Texas House, later the Texas Senate a quorum. That happened in Wisconsin and a variety of other places. So this has happened before. But the issue here is that when, indeed, the legislature doesn't have a quorum and they need to get those representatives, it's the legislature that needs to take care of this. But now they're having the state cops take care of this. And that's kind of a separation of powers issue. Use of police, it says, creates practical problems. For one thing, the absent Republican legislatures have not committed a crime. Walkouts have a long history in Oregon, never been part of the criminal code. In 2001, Democrats walked out to prevent the Republican majority from passing a redistricting bill. Boy, we've seen that many times in Texas and Wisconsin. I think we saw it in Iowa and some other places. The majority did not resort to bringing the state police in, but this is a little bit different. And the reason the minority of Republicans left is because the Oregon Senate is actually wanting to pass a carbon cap and trade tax bill, back to this idea of climate change. And historically, when legislators have walked out in the past, the House majority, which I just mentioned back in 2001 was Republican, now in this case the Democrats, have been responsible for getting them to return, but not getting the executive branch to do that. And if you're not familiar, I'm going to go on from this in just a minute. It's been interesting because this article that came out said disappearing quorums are nothing new. I had forgotten about this. Abraham Lincoln famously jumped out of the window as a young Whig in the Illinois state legislature to help his party deprive, at that time, Democrats of having a quorum. This has happened, as we've pointed out, in a number of state houses over the years. And certainly Oregon, both houses need 2/3 of their members present. In the Senate, Democrats just short of that fraction with, of course, 60% of the seats. More recent federal examples, which we've talked about, which, again, I don't condone, I look at it with a smile, but sometimes when you've had really closely divided bodies, a few absent members from the majority can make it difficult. In 1988, for example, Democrats clung to a 54-45 majority, had trouble keeping their 51 members in the chamber at one time. You have Republicans filibustered a Democrat spending bill that year and used the disappearing quorum to frustrate the majority's efforts. The minority's party members requested a quorum call and then fled, and the majority kept coming up short. So at that time, the majority leader, which was Senator Robert Byrd, ordered the sergeant of arms to round up the absentees, which he did. Capitol Police, who work for the Congress, not the executive branch, found Republican Bob Packwood and carried him bodily into the chamber, giving the majority that was required for the presence of 51 senators. I'm smiling and laughing because in some respects it's pretty pathetic. And it's happened most of the time by Democrats leaving the state legislature, but in the case that they used there in the federal government back in 1988, and, of course, the more recent one here in Oregon, they've been Republicans. Doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats, stay there, win the argument, lose the argument, but don't walk out. That just makes no sense at all. But those are some issues, certainly, that we're going to be addressing. And just before we run out of time, let me just mention Tucker Carlson. I mentioned that, of course, Andy Ngo appeared in the program, but Tucker Carlson also wrote an op-ed piece this weekend. He was actually co-authored with him, and it was entitled Woke Fascism. And it's very similar to a Viewpoints commentary I wrote back in February called Woke Politics. And it begins with this very important question that we need to ask as we see these attacks, as we see even the Democratic presidential campaign unfolding, because Tucker Carlson and his co-author asked this: how do you know if you're living in a free society? Here's a quick test. Are you allowed to say obviously true things in public? His book in 1984, George Orwell put it this way: freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. But, of course, we recognize that you can say true things and have to apologize. A couple of examples that Tucker Carlson uses are Mayor Pete had to apologize for saying all lives matter. That is true. All lives, black, white, whatever race, matter. But African-American activists said that the statement was offensive, so he had to apologize. Kirsten Gillibrand, I've used her as an example before, had to apologize for using the phrase, are you ready for this? Illegal alien. She had to apologize for that. More recently talked about having to read a confession on live television because a few years ago she expressed sympathy for the idea of a closed border. But in my commentary next week, I point out that you've got more than just problems with candidates. Almost every day, and I saw one this weekend, you run into a grade school child or a kid in middle school that gets disciplined for saying that there are only two genders. The one I read over the weekend where the child was suspended for saying there are only two genders. You don't see that as often in high school or college. That's because high school students and college students figured out real early on you should never challenge a teacher or a professor when it comes to gender identity or sexual orientation. But back to the bigger issue, I found that on college campuses today, you aren't even really allowed to ask a legitimate question about things like race, immigration, climate change. It's not just the fact that you can't state your opinion, you can't state the truth. You aren't even allowed to ask the question of what evidence somebody has for their perspective or their opinion. And so that's what it looks like when you live in a society of woke fascism. And that's the piece by Tucker Carlson, which you can read if you'd like to do so. Well, that's all we have for today. I hope that you appreciated some of the conversation we had with Michelle Bachmann. She was on last hour, and I thought it was not only great to hear what is happening as she's going overseas to certainly speak to various leaders in various countries, but also I wanted her to share this funny and kind of fascinating story about how she ended up in politics. And it's a great illustration that, she wasn't planning on running for office. She ran for office, won. And then she decided maybe she'd run for Congress, ran for office and won. Then she ran for the presidency and didn't win the nomination, but certainly had a profound influence. And so if she can do it, I think the implication is maybe you could do it as well. So take the time to get involved. We're the salt of the earth. We're the light of the world. And I think God is depending on us to make a difference in our community. Hope that you'll appreciate the material that we've made available on the website today. Don't forget, my Viewpoints commentary is there. It talks about the showdown with Iran, and we'll come back and talk more about its significance next, maybe Wednesday. But tomorrow will be our Tuesday Millennial Roundtable. Nick Pitts will be sitting in on this chair and actually hosting a very robust debate on some very important issues. So again, you can visit our website, pointofview.net. You'll click on the button that says Donate. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.